Hello, my name is Mark MacDonald and I'm a partner with KPMG based in Toronto but working nationally. And I have some of the leadership responsibility for our public sector practice. And today I'm very happy to be here to discuss some work that we are involved with around addressing the catalyzing role or the potential for a catalytic role of government in enhancing impact investing. And I will be sharing with you some thoughts and some preliminary findings and research that we have been conducting. I'll start by giving you the overall context of the paper. It will become a longer paper in time for its submission to a G8 special task force, but we'll get to that in a moment. It is an approach that has some breadth to it, but also some limitations, and I'll just discuss those, and then we'll get into the meat of it, which is really an understanding of what impact investing is in Canada, the acceleration of it, the potential for the catalytic role of government being in response to a policy landscape, and then I'll take you through 4 potential broadly defined policy instruments that we are investigating with our partners at the Mars Centre for Impact Investing and others around potential applicability in the Canadian policy setting. And so really the objective is to assess the potential role for government in the catalysis of Canadian impact investing, to contribute to the examination of the ecosystem of impact investing in Canada through empirical research, and then to put the Canadian context into its broader global one, and hopefully to make a contribution at that level as well. So the context for the research that we've been doing actually began at the G8 level when British Prime Minister David Cameron, who is I think a very strongly acknowledged champion of impact investing, struck on his recommendation a special task force which was accepted by the G8 on social impact investing. And the chair of that task force is Sir Ronald Cohen, who himself is a very strong and very highly acknowledged leader in the field of impact investing, both as an investor and as a champion. So the task force has solicited advice and recommendations from its national member states, and the Canadian effort is being chaired by Ilse Turnigt, who is, people will understand and know, the Chief Executive Officer of the Mars Discovery District, and her team primarily through the Centre for Impact Investing. But there's a very diverse group of members and stakeholders that comprise Canada's National Advisory Board. And essentially we're investigating 2 dimensions of impact investing. The first one is what is the potential role for government in terms of changing either income tax regulations, corporate legislation, and so forth in let's call it some of the defining dimensions of the impact investing landscape. And then the second, and the current focus of today's topic, is on other forms of government intervention in the catalysis of capital. And so essentially what we're trying to identify is, in the eyes of key stakeholders, which can include investors, can include providers of social impact activity, the entrepreneurs that we're trying to support here, and in fact government itself. So in the eyes of those stakeholders, what are the potential roles for government? And let's put some time frame around that and try and talk about interventions that could be achieved and have considerable impact within, let's say, a 2-year period of time. The primary audience is the Canadian federal government, but obviously I think for everybody who is in the audience, you will understand that this is more than just a Canadian federal government issue. In fact, the provinces and the municipalities have each got a role to play. In fact, the provinces have got a very strong role to play, as much of the jurisdiction around traditional entrepreneur activity, much of the provision of many of the services are in fact in provincial jurisdiction. I'll just again emphasize that this work is being done jointly by KPMG and by the Mars Centre for Impact Investing. And while obviously there is a connection with what I'm talking about today and the Mars Centre, this is not in fact the paper. The paper is yet to be completed. It should be ready in depth for the fall. There will go through a number of iterations, and by the fall of 2014 we will be in a position to make strong recommendations. So the approach is a short, sweet, to the point examination of what is the catalytic role of government in trying to align capital with entrepreneurs to develop the overall ecosystem of impact investing in Canada. The paper itself will end up being really quite short, 8 to 10 pages. It is designed to sort of cut to the chase, and it will be strongly recommendation-based. The innovation that comes out of it is not just the fact that there's a bit of state-of-the-art desktop analysis, but it's actually also based on a pretty comprehensive interview schedule. Up to date, we're at about 20 interviews. Every time we get one interviewee, they recommend, oh, you need to talk to this other person, and so forth. And so, in fact, we've got a fairly robust and I think a very encouraging level of participation and interest that is out there in the market around this topic. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to balance the insights that can be gained from those individuals with, let's call it, the theory of the policy intervention, and to come up with some practical recommendations on what might actually happen. So today is some of the general context for that, and you will have to stay tuned for the specific recommendations. Now, let's get into a bit more of the content. Impact investing, as I hope many of you understand, is in fact not a new concept, but one that has been around for literally decades. You can find many examples of investment, private and or quasi-private and or public investment in the development of innovations around the delivery of a whole range of socially impactful activities, and they really do go on for decades and decades. But perhaps what is happening more recently, and this has emerged primarily over the last decade, perhaps even shorter than that, is that there's, in a sense, been a reattention to the whole issue of impact investing. And what has emerged in part is this concept that there is a difference between investing with impact, where you can have, for instance, an activity that has got decidedly a commercial objective, but it also has positive social externalities. Well, that is excellent, but that's not quite the same thing as impact investing. And so the fundamental difference there is that the mission of the investment is the impact when we're talking about impact investing. Other phrases are mission-related investing, and often people talk about social impact, but it can be broader than that as well. So it can include environmental, it can include socioeconomic, and so forth. Now, because we are talking about investing, financial return definitely still matters. But again, because of the social or the impact related, it's not just the profit return that is measured, but also the actual impact itself. And so one of the growing areas of interest, of course, is what are those mechanisms for measuring the impact, and how is it that we can determine what the attribution or the incrementality of a particular venture is in actually achieving the impact which is desired. So the growth in Canada in the last just few years has been really quite remarkable, and in fact in very recent times we have started to see some specific and growing numbers of interventions. So our RBC, one of Canada's obviously largest banks, has just recently announced its Generator Fund. It is essentially a loan vehicle where it is trying to support loans to impact investors. There are new government funding targets. I happen to be speaking to you here from Alberta, and Alberta has recently announced $1 billion in an endowment for Social Innovation Fund, which is going to support microloans, research, and innovation in model development. There have been legislative reforms. The province of British Columbia has recently introduced hybrid company structures, which allows for essentially commercial activity to go to support not-for-profit activity, which is an innovation. Ontario has launched the Social Venture Exchange, again with the Mars Discovery District or with the Mars Centre for Impact Investing. And social impact bonds are starting to take a hold in some of the Canadian landscape. Now, when we, as part of this research, talk about impact investing, we've tried to distill it into two very simple sort of concepts. And at the broadest level, really what we're talking about is that there can be a catalytic role potentially for government to enhance commercial activity, which is oriented around impact investing, and that commercial activity has a bit more of a traditional flavor to it. We talk about traditional markets, we talk about experienced capital, where there in fact are consumers, and so we are talking quite a bit more about the enhancement of existing market-based activity, or what I've characterized here as impact activity, where it's non-traditional markets, where there is not a traditional cash flow, for instance, available, and so it is much more around the innovation. And I think arguably this is the area of focus that holds the most amount of promise. Now, the overall policy landscape, and hopefully this shows up on the presentation, we've tried to characterize here as being along a couple of different dimensions. And so one of them is the supply of capital, where we have sources of capital on a continuum ranging from philanthropic and quite traditional sorts of forms of charity or funds through more venture capital or entrepreneurial type mechanisms up into the larger end of town through institutional investors. The type of investment also is on a continuum and essentially runs from loans or debt type vehicles through to equity positions. On the demand for capital side, where the provision of the impact service itself takes place, there tends to be a focus on some target sectors. I've highlighted a few here. Issues like, or areas like affordable housing, social services, economic development. Others do exist as well, including environment and technology. And at the enterprise stage, so again, we can be talking about investing in very early on startup phases, or in fact into more mature businesses where the objective is to commercialize or to scale. And I think that over time, what we will find as we get more experience and the impact investing ecosystem grows, this will be the end of that, or the end of the spectrum that is most favorable, will in fact be around how do we scale. And then what we're trying to examine, as I've tried to emphasize here, is what is the potential catalytic role for government. And we conceive that there are probably four: credit enhancement, tax incentives, direct investment, and payment by results. And so at a summary level anyway, the credit enhancement instruments are likely the ones that are perhaps the least interventionist, and perhaps also as a result of that, they're the ones that have arguably one of the stronger connections to existing tools where governments are already intervening. So these are talking about risk interventions to support capital, primarily to support lenders, and has a strong private investment parallel. And in fact, the objective is to mitigate the risk as collateral, if you will, to allow for the lenders to accept the higher than average risk profile of the investee, and government's role is to potentially come in and to help to enhance that credit. One of the specific areas where many of you may have some direct experience in that in Canada is the small business loan guarantees, where higher risk investments in small and medium-sized enterprises in the private market are again supported through Canadian federal government credit enhancements. And so really the idea is that there could be a parallel to be applied in the social entrepreneurship space. On the tax incentive side, again, tax incentives are a well understood and rather ubiquitous set of policy tools. An interesting parallel or an interesting potential for some innovation here might in fact allow for the Canadian policy setting to learn from international ones. And here we're talking about tax incentives that obviously go to offset profit, but at the same time can also offset potential loss. And so one of the social investment tax relief measures in the UK, which is highlighted here as a particular example, offers up the opportunity for investors who have made an investment in a going concern, but if that investment goes sour or there's a loss after the fact, the investor is able to reclassify that investment not as a typical one, but in fact as a donation, as a charitable donation, and claim a tax credit on that basis. And so here is just one of the innovative forms of potential policy intervention from around the world. The focus here is really still on the supply side of the capital. And as I mentioned earlier, when we had that concept about the supply of capital but also the demand for capital, there are a couple of potential roles for government to catalyze more on that demand side. And again, there are two. The first one is are direct investment instruments. So this really has government as an investor, government as a seed financer, government as a matching investor, potentially for the use of return. Again, there are some examples in private market activity in Canada where the Canadian federal government has been an investor at risk with the expectation of return. Well, that same sort of model could potentially be applied into the impact investing sphere. Again, there are many examples from around the world, including some in Canada. In the province where I live in Ontario, for instance, the the rural economic development funds that are managed there have got an impact investing flavor to them. Government, the province there, is a direct investor in those activities. And then the final suite of potential catalytic roles or catalytic policy interventions is in the generalized frame of payment by results or payment for outcomes. And this is where you see instruments that have got some vogue currently, like social impact bonds being potentially applied. And here it is essentially a set of instruments that would be designed to pay for higher levels of outcome, and essentially it's about payment for a higher level of social outcome or social impact than perhaps the government is able to provide itself through its own provision of service. And so there can be, not necessarily has to be, but there can be an offsetting dimension to this. So the provision of a service that is currently provided by government could be offset by a social entrepreneur, and there could be some investment vehicle around that. And of course, fairly recently, just about 4 or 5 weeks ago, the Saskatchewan government has announced a social impact bond called Sweet Dreams, and that is to deal with single mothers, and the attempt is to provide service for those single mothers so that the risk of the child being displaced from the family is decreased, and there is an investment that involves a bond structure against that. And the perspective here really is that it deals much more directly with the demand side of government. of the provision of social entrepreneurship. And in general, it would provide an outcomes fund against which payment for results could be achieved. And so those are the four major categories of potential intervention that we have been dealing with. And as I said earlier, really the next step is to finalize the research, to engage with not only the stakeholder committee or community, but also the National Advisory Board, and to consider then what are the set of recommendations that will come forward as a result. And again, to reiterate, those recommendations will go to the international task force that is being chaired out of the G8, and as a result of that, hopefully it has some strong imprimatur for actual policy intervention. And ultimately, of course, that would be the desire. Thank you.